From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Well, in case you haven't heard, the Department of Labor this morning at 8:30 Eastern Time released its jobs numbers, and boy, did they get everyone's attention. They were really remarkable and remarkably higher than we expected. To bring us the numbers, we turn now to Michael McKee. He's Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. So use whatever euphemism you want. Blew the socks out for whatever. They were pretty high.
They were pretty high. It's a good day to be Joe Biden, I'll tell you that, and a bad day to be one of his critics. Things can change, but he finally gets reversion to the mean on having a little luck. The president's economy gained 528,000 jobs in July, and those of you who know me say, I've been reporting that we have restored jobs every month, but we're now finally above where we used to be. Unemployment falls to 3.5%. That matches the all-time low in January of 2020. Average hourly earnings unchanged, 5.2%. We're still getting paid. Total payrolls, as I said, now top the January 2020 pre-pandemic high by 32,000 jobs. Of course, Washington, like everywhere else, is a what have you done for me lately town. So next week, we're going to turn to the tough things, David, the inflation side of the Fed's mandate. Wednesday, we get CPI. Thursday, we get PPI. Friday, import prices. We'll see what happens with oil. And that Michigan inflation number that has captivated the Fed about inflation expectations with gas prices going down so dramatically and the overall economy performing well, people having jobs, maybe they'll feel a little bit more optimistic about things going forward.
Well, it would be nice to have jobs and lower inflation at the same time, but we'll see if we can do that. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Michael McKee. Now, to take us through these numbers and interpret them for us, we turn to Betsey Stevenson. She's professor of public policy and economics at Michigan's Ford School out in Ann Arbor. So welcome, Professor. Good to have you back with us. These are obviously very encouraging job numbers. What is driving this?
I mean, the report was really a fantastic report in that we clearly have an expanding economy still. We see employers out there trying to hire. And here's the good news. Workers are taking the jobs. If all they were doing was trying to hire, we could see that upward wage pressure, but no jobs growth. But what we're seeing is there is some upward wage pressure. That's the worrying part. The good part is, over 500,000 people got jobs. So, that says we're in a pretty strong economy. And I think, frankly, we're still just recovering from the pandemic. We have added all the jobs back to 2019, but hey, it's 2022. We should have had a lot of growth between 2019 and 2022. So getting us back to what would have happened if we hadn't had the pandemic, well, for that, we've still got a ways to go. And what we see is our economy still going there.
So I think that some people maybe had a little bit of a head fake thrown at them because there were some indications of some softening and things like the JOLTS numbers as well as the unemployment claims. I mean, you're the former chief economist of the Department of Labor. Why did those tend to indicate there'd be softening and then we got these numbers?
Well, I think what we do see is that hiring is starting to slow down. If you look at a wide range of indicators, we see some companies starting to think, maybe I overhired. So we're hearing these news reports of some companies starting to maybe even cut back their workforce. But that is not big enough to make up for the lots and lots and lots of companies that are out there continuing to expand. So I do think softening is coming. It obviously didn't come this month, but it is coming because the economy is clearly starting to slow. But one of the reasons we have high prices out there is everybody wants to go out to dinner, and there's simply not enough people working in the restaurants to feed them all. Everybody wants to get on a plane, and there's not enough people working in the airlines. So we need to see this hiring continue to make sure that supply continues to expand to meet the demand that's out there. And the Fed's going to work to keep trying to tamp down demand. And the goal will be to bring demand and supply together in a nice, happy place where nobody has to lose a job to do it.
So, Professor, address one other apparent anomaly, at least to some of us here, and that is the ratio of employed people to the overall population, something that President Biden in the past has said he really likes to focus on. That seems to be going down even as we're creating all these new jobs. How does that work?
So, I mean, look, I'll give you a wonky answer, which is we've got, two different measures of how the labor market's doing. We survey households and we survey businesses. The household reports over the last few months, the household report has been pretty weak. It's been sort of saying we're stagnating. This month, we saw actually a lot of jobs added and we saw more people get jobs. So we did see employment grow. We saw that employment ratio grow in this current month. But you're absolutely right that they got to come together. Look, we're fighting an aging population where natural demographics is going to bring down that labor force participation rate. Instead, focus on the labor force participation rate of people who are sort of in the prime age to be working, sort of in that 25 to 55. Although as I get older, I want to expand that range upward, but in that sort of range. And there, what we see is we're pretty much getting close to being back to the labor force participation rate of prime age individuals we had in 2019. Again, I still think we've got some growth to come there. And I think that we're seeing it. It's just, it's going to be herky-jerky in that data report where it's going to, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, et cetera, until we get to a place where we're, seeing real growth there. But I think that it's still expanding.
Betsey, I've seen some people point at the possibility of long COVID as contributing to some of the people not coming back to the workforce. Do you see anything in the data that would support that?
I do, and I have been trying to take a look at that. What I don't see is elevated people out of work because they have a job and they're sick. But I do see elevated numbers of people saying that they're not looking for work because of health-related issues. I certainly wouldn't come out here and say that that's long COVID. I don't know for sure. I don't think the research has been clear on that. But we do have every reason to believe that, the pandemic had significant health impacts on the population. And if you have a significant health impact on the population, it's going to affect people's ability to work. And when they do work, their productivity at work.
Finally, we do have CPI numbers coming out next week. We're going to be focused particularly on the core CPI numbers. Do we see evidence of the wage price spiral? You mentioned the wages were up nicely this month.
Well, it's such a funny thing because everybody wants to see wages up, except for we're worried that if wages are going up, then the employers will push up their prices, which will then mean people want their wages up even higher, and that's that wage price spiral. I don't think we've seen a lot of evidence that inflation's being driven by wage price spiral. But what the Fed's going to be looking at is not the 528,000 jobs we added. That's okay. But what they're really worried about is what's this underlying wage pressure? Is this broad based? Is this due to the labor market being really tight? Is it likely to continue? I think they need to be really careful because there are lags in people getting wage increases that are related to past inflation. A lot of people only get their wages reset once a year. I get a raise once a year. And so we're going to see some increases in wages in the coming months with just things like people's contracts resetting in the fall and, in the coming year. And they get, their wages raised because, hey, their real wages fell due to inflation. Yeah. But what we want is to make sure that doesn't sort of take off like a snowball going downhill.
Professor, it's always great to talk to you about these jobs numbers. Thank you so much. That's Professor Betsey Stevenson of Michigan's Ford School. Coming up, the Inflation Reduction Act looks like it will see the light of day after all. We talk with Senator Mark Warner of Virginia. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. I want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. For that, we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, thank you. China is lashing out at U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi for her trip to Taiwan this week. Today, Beijing announced it's imposing unspecified sanctions on Speaker Pelosi and her family. China is also halting meetings with American military leaders and cooperation with the U.S. on drugs, climate, and a number of other issues. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov say they're willing to talk about a prisoner swap involving WNBA star Brittany Griner and another jailed American. The diplomats spoke on the sidelines of a meeting in Cambodia today, a day after a Moscow court sentenced Griner to 9 years in prison on drug charges. President Biden called Griner's punishment unacceptable. Rishi Sunak is facing widespread criticism after a video emerged of him appearing to boast about deliberately moving funding away from deprived urban areas of the UK while he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Sunak was speaking to a group of Tory activists in southeast England. He's struggling to overturn Liz Truss's huge lead in the race to be Britain's next prime minister. In Kentucky, many people are still cleaning up from last week's storms, and now there are new threats of flooding. Forecasters say nearly the entire state is on a flood watch through the weekend. Last week's floods killed at least 37 people and sent floodwaters as high as rooftops. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, they didn't make it look easy or even certain, but in the end, the senators all came together to apparently on this reconciliation package, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. At least the Democrats did, and that may be enough to get it through. We turned now to one of the people who was in the thick of all this. He is Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. So, Senator, thank you so much for being with us. As I say, from the outside at least, it looked pretty messy. Give us a sense of what it was like on the inside. When did you know you had a deal?
Well, let me assure you, David, it looked pretty messy on the inside as well. And while this bill, and I'll come to this very quickly, but is going to be just one party, I would point out to most of your viewers, those of us who've been very active in all the bipartisan groups, we've had a good run. You know, we did the CHIPS bill, we did the infrastructure bill, we did the guns bill. We've got a legislation to try to correct what's called the Electoral Count Act, so there's never the kind of January 6th activity of a vice president making a wrong choice. So we've had a pretty good run. On this bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, first of all, I think it's a better bill than it was a year ago when it was probably way too ambitious. And even as recently as yesterday, both with my friends, Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, there was a lot of back and forth. Senator Sinema had some things she wanted changed in the bill. You know, I was trying to work closely with her and others, and you know, it finally got to yes. And I think this bill is going to be extraordinarily significant. It does a meaningful down payment on debt reduction. It finally allows us to negotiate drug prices the way other countries do, and will bring down the cost of drugs. It has, and a lot of this credit goes to Joe Manchin. It has a major move towards greener energy, but it realizes we got to have a transition. So whether more American natural gas, which is important, for example, right now in terms of security, in terms of getting Europeans off Russian gas, permitting reform. And I think about my friend Larry Summers, who my Republican colleagues always like to quote. He's done a thorough review of this bill and has said it is very much anti-inflationary. So I think it hits all four key items. And while the next few days are going to be messy in terms of what's called the vote-a-rama, I think it will get through and ultimately be looked back on as a very significant piece of legislation.
Yeah, Larry Summers has been on our air right here saying exactly that on Bloomberg. So as you say, it looks like there's going to be a vote-a-rama, perhaps a vote on the overall packages as soon as this weekend. Give me a sense, though, a timeline on another part of this, because I know that the carried interest provision is very important to you. You've come out and said that it's very important to you. That's one thing you've been talking with Senator Sinema about. I understand that will be handled separately. What's the timeline on that? And how important is it to get that done before November, just in case there's a change in the majority on the House side?
Well, David, let me be clear. As you know, I was a venture capitalist. I've made a lot of money through carried interest. And the idea of valuing work that's a long-term partner running a venture fund, I think there is value that needs to be recognized there. And the way this was originally positioned would have been a big giveaway to folks who do leverage buyouts at the expense, for example, of people, venture and otherwise, that do long-term, riskier investment. So I know there have been abuses in carried interest, and I was hoping we could make some significant reforms in this bill. Senator Sinema still had some questions, but she's committed to work with me to see if we can do a meaningful reform on carried interest, to make it fairer, to make it more transparent, to get rid of some of the abuse. Can we get that done in time in a bill that would either go in a future reconciliation or could get 60 votes? That's going to be a big hill to climb, but we're going to give it our best.
Senator, another provision, as I understand it, of the compromise here is a tax on stock buybacks, which will raise a lot of revenue, which will make up for whatever is lost, perhaps in the reform of carried interest. Is there an effective date on the bill as it's being drafted right now? Because it might make a difference, as you know, to corporations about when they do some buybacks here.
Well, listen, there are times when stock buybacks make a lot of sense. And frankly, they've made a lot of sense when interest rates have been at record low amounts, which has allowed companies even to borrow money to do stock buyback. That, though, seems like it's gaming the system. And I've been disappointed when companies have said, lower our taxes and we're going to invest more in plant and equipment, and instead they use it for stock buybacks. So putting a 1% tax on those stock buybacks, I think, makes sense. I think the effective date is when the president signs the bill, but it's a fair question, and let me reserve the right to correct myself if I'm wrong on the effective date. I also do think, though, that as interest rates go up, I think the number of companies who will use stock buybacks is probably going to decrease, because when the cost of capital was so low, it made sense that if you felt your stock was undervalued to go out and even in the case of a company like Apple, which borrowed funds to do stock buybacks. As interest rates go up, even with or without this 1% tax, I think the number of buybacks will start decreasing.
Senator, I want to turn, if we could, to what's going on right now with China and Taiwan. As I say, you are the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. There have been developments even today, and one of them was China's announcement, apparently, that it's going to suspend some regular communications back and forth with the military, between the Chinese military and the U.S. military, as well as suspend some climate talks. What do you know about that, and how dangerous could that be? Because one of the things that keeps us from making certain mistakes and getting into a conflict is having a lot of communications, including with the military.
Yeah, David, I think it is really bad policy for China to decrease these back channel communications. Matter of fact, in moments of tension, I think we need to increase communications, not decrease. We do know that President Xi has made very clear that he expects during his tenure, and he's about to be reelected within the Politburo in this November, that he thinks his destiny is to reunite Taiwan with China. It sounds not that much dissimilar than Putin feeling like his destiny was bringing Ukraine back into Russia. And we are dependent on Taiwan, for example, for semiconductor chips. While we've passed legislation to increase domestic supply, the cutting edge chips are still made in Taiwan. And if China were to clamp down on Taiwan, even in terms of an economic blockade, that could have it would not create a recession, potentially a worldwide depression, not just here, but so many countries rely on those key components from Taiwan. I also think we need to stand with Taiwan. And I think that's been the policy of governments, Democrat or Republican. We've always tried to keep a little bit of what's called strategic ambiguity, or a little bit of fuzziness around those commitments. And I think Speaker Pelosi said that this was not a change in American policy, because clearly other congressional delegations have visited Taiwan. But I, as I've said on your show and others, while our immediate focus is with Russia and Ukraine, our strategic competitor in the 21st century is China. It is in technology domain after technology domain, and we need to be competitive. We also need to make sure we keep these communications open with the PRC on a regular basis.
Senator, finally, you mentioned a possible economic blockade. What about a physical blockade? There's a report in the Wall Street Journal today that state media in China is now bragging that what they've done with their military exercises around Taiwan demonstrates that they have the capacity to actually put a blockade around Taiwan. Is that right from what you understand? And what is the risk of that?
Well, I'm not going to comment on any of the intelligence, but an economic physical blockade of Taiwan would elevate this crisis exponentially. And as I mentioned, not just America, but the whole world is reliant on Taiwanese production and capacity around the most cutting-edge semiconductor chips that goes into our most advanced fighters, ships, satellites. That kind of physical blockade, I hope it would not come to pass, because pretty much any of the scenarios would be pretty dreadful.
Okay, Senator, always really appreciate your time and your wisdom on these things. That's Senator Mark Warner of Virginia. Coming up, we'll take a look at how markets responding to the surprisingly strong jobs numbers out today. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. The big economic data today, of course, with those blowout jobs numbers. And to give us the market reaction, we turn now to Abigail Doolittle. So a fair amount of reaction, Abigail.
A fair amount of reaction, very volatile reaction. It's the whole idea that good news is bad news, then it turned into good news is good news, and now it's good news is bad news again because we have stocks down. That, of course, comes because the jobs report was such a blowout report, such a clean report, such a strong read on the economy. It sent yields shockingly higher. That two-year yield right now is up about 20 basis points. And the yield curve, of course, because the 10-year yield is not up as much, it's the most inverted in 22 years. So you have this interesting story between this super strong job market and then this usual tell on a recession. It really puts the Fed in a bit of a bind.
Well, it's the most inverted, as you pointed out, but beyond that, the duration, because it's coming up on a month now, I think, that it's been inverted, which I think people think may be important.
Yeah, well, it's no joke in terms of just the idea that you have this hot economy that's hitting a slowing economy, and yet now we have this new, flexion into it, this strong jobs report. It really just puts the Fed in a bind. Some are saying, or actually the markets are really pricing in 75 bips raise in September. That will be the third time in a row, record, a historic event. Of course, there are two CPI prints, but the idea is how does the Fed deal with this? Because the interesting thing about it is jobs typically not a tell on a recession. When the economy actually falls into a recession, that's when jobs start to fall off. So the Fed is dealing with what seems like a healthy economy. On the other hand, based on jobs right now. On the other hand, you have this stock market that, yes, we've had this bit of a recovery rally, but overall, it on the crystal ball 6 months out perspective is suggesting that some sort of a recession is ahead. The Fed has a lot of work on their hands.
Yeah, no kidding. A lot of work on their hands. That's fair enough. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets and how they're responding to those jobs numbers. Coming up, we're going to get the White House reaction to those remarkable jobs numbers with Heather Boushey of the Council of Economic Advisors. What does this mean for the White House and their economic policy? How are they making adjustments, if at all? I'm sure they're pleased with all those jobs, though. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television, and we are on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Those jobs numbers that came in this morning were way higher than expected, 528,000 to be precise. And earlier today, the Labor Secretary Marty Walsh spoke with my colleague Jonathan Ferro on the Open to talk about how good those numbers were. This is part of what he had to say.
When you look at the different sectors, most of the economy is recovered. The jobs that were that companies had pre-pandemic are all returned, so it shows good gains. We've showed some good wage growth. We've shown good areas. Manufacturing is one of those areas that certainly we've seen come back, not just come back to pre-pandemic levels, but go beyond that. I think with the CHIPS bill that was passed and it's going to be signed into law next week, we can do more manufacturing in the United States of America, which in the long term will help us with some of the inflationary pressures such as semiconductors and more microchips.
Secretary Walsh, what a turnaround this has been since the pandemic. Can we just take a moment to think about that, how much we've recovered over the last couple of years? And can you talk to me about how sustainable you think these jobs gains might be?
Well, I'll tell you, pandemic, March of 2020, I was the mayor of Boston, and we were shutting businesses down. We were shutting restaurants down. We didn't really know what the economy held, and thinking about where we are today was really incredible. And I think that this will, in my opinion, will be sustainable moving forward. I think companies are understanding. I think we're going to have a new type of economy. I think we're still obviously dealing with inflationary pressures. You talked about it right before we got on the air here. I heard you talking, and I think that we're going to adapt and adjust, and we're going to move forward. I think that the infrastructure law that was signed into law, we're going to see more investments all across America on roads and bridges. I think with the CHIPS bill that was passed, passed and move forward, we're going to see more investment in manufacturing. Hopefully, the bill that's being worked on now in front of the Senate is going to be working on prescription drug costs and environmental climate change and some other areas is going to help. When you really think about a lot of what's happened here under the Biden administration is something that we've talked about for the last decade or so, and these are all going to be good bills and good investments to move our economy and, quite honestly, move America forward.
I know you've got a lot of people to talk to this morning. I did want to talk to you about the negotiations on the West Coast with the ports. This
I was going to bring it up.
I know you are, because this was your quote last time we spoke. You said, next month if I come on this show, if we don't have a contract and we're not close to a contract, then you and I might be having a very different conversation. So I guess, do we have one? Are we close to one? Or are we having a very different conversations?
No, I don't know how close we are to getting the contract, but one thing that has happened since we've spoken and both sides have agreed is the health care, and that was a big sticking point. That's usually a big sticking point, the costs around health care and who's going to pay for health care, and that was negotiated and solved about 10 days ago. So I'm very pleased with that. Now they're on to the next phase of negotiation, and usually when you think about contracts negotiation, the biggest sticking point is around health care, pensions, things like that, and those are in the rearview mirror now. Now they're moving forward on some of the other issues they want to tackle. So I feel good where we are. If I said that, I probably should have used my words a little better if we don't have a contract by next month. But I am very confident where we are in the negotiation right now. I am not concerned. And I stay in very close contact with both the longshoremen union and the companies on the ports to offer any type of support we need. But every time I talk to them, they say we're moving forward.
That was Labor Secretary Marty Walsh speaking earlier today on Bloomberg about those jobs numbers. We're going to turn now back to the question of China, our relations with China and its reaction to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. And to take us through that, we welcome Robert Daly. He's director of the Kissinger Center on China at the Wilson Center. So thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Give us your take about the Chinese reaction at this point. We had the military exercises. Now today, we hear they're going to suspend communications, the back channels, so to speak, on the military, as well as some climate talks.
Yeah, not only have Chinese reactions to date been predictable, they were really quite clearly signaled by China, which had told us that it would take unprecedented military actions if Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan. And indeed they have. And one of the great dangers of this is now that China has established a new baseline, right? They fired live missiles near Taiwan's territorial waters. What it means is that the next time they feel provoked, and that time is certainly going to come, they will respond based on that baseline. And so you're going to have continued escalation in the Taiwan Straits. It's going to get more and more dangerous.
Well, and that takes me back a little bit to the communications, military to military, because certainly during the height of the Cold War, when in the Soviet Union, one of the things that helped us avoid really a shooting conflict was being able to communicate, even on back channel. How much are we giving up if, in fact, China follows through and we don't have those communications military to military with China?
Military to military communications have been greatly reduced between the United States and China over the past few years. There have been some channels open, but military dialogues, like other dialogues, have really fallen victim to mutual distrust. And this is extremely dangerous because it means we're not going to be very good at crisis management. In the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, which are getting more crowded with military assets, the likelihood of some kind of accidental conflict is going up. And it's very important in those cases to be able to pick up a telephone and speak with a counterpart and explain what has happened and to try to walk it back. And so losing those contacts is dangerous. How long this is going to persist, we don't know. But the Chinese have long been very suspicious of military to military talks. And now they've taken this opportunity to cut those off at least for a time. It's another factor which makes it more perilous to be in the region.
Did Speaker Pelosi's trip, in your opinion, make things worse, or did they just reveal what was already there?
It made things worse. It is true that U.S.-China relations have been declining. We are in what is essentially a new kind of Cold War footing already. And certainly China had been encroaching on Taiwan in numerous ways over the past several years. They've been bringing their ships and their fighter planes closer and closer to Taiwanese airspace. So all of that sort of big dynamic is already in place. But on that chessboard, the Pelosi trip allowed China to advance another pawn or two. They've taken unprecedented moves, shown how they can blockade Taiwan readily, and they're now working right up into Taiwan's territorial waters. That would not be true today if Pelosi had not gone to Taiwan.
Pick up on the blockade issue, if you would. I think it was in the Wall Street Journal today, reports that state media in China is saying what they've demonstrated with their military activity around that island is that they can blockade if they want. What is the extent of the threat from a blockade of China, of Taiwan? Is that realistic?
It is realistic, and it's a move to which the United States does not have a very good response. We have on our side done a number of tabletop exercises and scenarios in which China, without firing a shot, essentially imposes a quarantine or a blockade on Taiwan and announces that any attempt to run that blockade would be construed as an act of war. The United States does not have an effective response to that scenario ready. And because we don't want China to impose a blockade on Taiwan and we do not want it to invade, we need to use our diplomacy to try to convince China that that isn't necessary to achieve their goals over time. And that's what we haven't been doing. We've forgotten about the diplomacy reassurance piece of cross-states relations. We've been very involved in signaling, in testing China, and we've been very involved in deterrence, which is necessary, but we have been neglecting diplomacy.
Well, when you talk about diplomacy, talk about the other countries in the region, allies and others, and what role they might play in this. I mean, how does Japan react to this? How does South Korea react to this? How do the Philippines react to this?
Japan, over the past 2 years, has come closer to an American perspective and has announced that in the case of an invasion of Taiwan, it would be in Japan's interest to help repel it. So Japan has expressed a very clear and risky willingness to be involved in a Taiwan conflict. South Korea knows that in the case of conflict in Taiwan, the United States would want to use military assets that are stationed in South Korea, and it appears to be moving toward more openness to that. But it doesn't mean they want to see it. There are no allies, there are no countries in the region that think that conflict in the Taiwan Strait would be good for them. They would like us to go back to trying to manage the status quo in Taiwan, which is frustrating, ambiguous, and uncertain, but it's been the peace in the Taiwan Straits, which has been kept by America's treating Taiwan in a one-China framework. That arrangement has allowed Taiwan to prosper, to become democratic, and has been a major factor in the economic development of East Asia. The United States seems to be moving away from that now.
Well, the United States says it's not, right? President Biden says it's not. Even Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, says she's not moving away from a one China. What do we need to do to persuade China that we are not changing our policy?
For most of the past 50 years, the one China policy has involved the United States being extremely sensitive to any appearance of official relations with Taiwan. And we've been sensitive to this because the Chinese themselves are hypersensitive to this. What the United States has done over the past few years is sent messages that we're really reducing the one China policy to a bare bones view that we recognize Beijing and only Beijing as the government of China. We don't recognize Taiwan as a country, but we have been behaving as though, other than that, there will be no restrictions on official interactions with Taiwan. And this is a change. It is a real change in the implementation and interpretation of the one China policy that Beijing has taken notice of and is very concerned about.
Okay, Mr. Daly, thank you so very much for your time today. That's Robert Daly of the Wilson Center in Washington. And now we want to go back to the White House for more reaction to those extraordinary jobs numbers out today. We already heard from Marty Walsh, who spoke earlier today to Bloomberg, but now we're going to go to Dr. Heather Boushey. She's a member of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Thank you so much for being with us, and also thank you for your patience. I understand we had some technical difficulties there. We heard from Marty Walsh, the Secretary of Labor, that these extraordinary jobs numbers are sustainable. Is that right? I mean, at some point we run out of people, do we not?
Well, certainly today's numbers are good news for the economy, good news for American families. We have seen this sustained level of job creation, about over 9.5 million jobs created since the president took office, this significant above expectations number of over 500,000 this past month. But one of the things is that while we have now gotten back to pre-pandemic in terms of employment and in terms of unemployment, we have also seen that the pace of job gains has slowed a bit. So if you look over the first 7 months of this year compared to the first 7 months of last year, it is a little bit slower, about 90,000 per month slower than it was last year. So we're seeing this leveling, which is what we want to see, this smooth transition to the kinds of steady, strong job creation month after month.
One of the things, Dr. Boushey, I've seen talked about a fair amount is the ratio of employed to population, something that you and President Biden have talked about. What is your assessment right now of that ratio and why more people aren't coming back into the job market?
Well, we see a couple of interesting things in this report today. One, we do see that some of the decline in the number of people in the labor force is actually because of teenagers dropping out. So that's one part of the story. And when you look at workers who are in their, in what we call as labor economists, their prime age, 25 to 54, you actually have seen consistent increases in the share who are in the labor force, and that does bode well. We are recovering from a historic pandemic. We do need to acknowledge that people need time to get their lives back in order to get back to the kinds of job participation that they had pre-pandemic, but we are seeing that happen slow and steady month after month.
As a practical matter, some of the fiscal stimulus that was put into the economy is starting to come off now. So will that have a negative effect on job creation, do you expect, in the out months as we go forward?
Well, given where we are today, that forecasters had predicted about half as many jobs as we saw created, I wouldn't want to put too much weight on exactly what we know for the future. But one of the things that we do see is that we've seen this strong uptick in manufacturing jobs, created over 600,000 since the president took office, the fastest rate of job creation in manufacturing since the 1950s. And that indicates, that's one of the indicators of, that firms are investing, they are getting, everybody back to work. And so as some of these fiscal relief package pieces come out of the economy, this continued job creation is what's going to keep things moving forward, and that's what we've seen already. Of course, consumers are entering this moment with relatively strong balance sheets, so there's a lot of strong foundation here for the job market moving forward.
I have to ask you about recession. Obviously, you don't have that within your control. I'm not even going to ask you to predict it, but what do you do, if anything, to prepare for it? Obviously, it doesn't look like we're in a recession right now, given these jobs numbers. At the same time, a lot of people are anticipating what the Federal Reserve is going to have to do in order to try to calm down the economy some. How do you prepare for the possible recession in 2023, which is what a lot of economists are expecting?
Well, I think continuing to focus on that strong foundation. The president came into office focused on getting people back to work after the pandemic. Unemployment was over 6% when he took office. It's now down to 3.5%, which is tied for the lowest rate in about 53 years. So you want to get folks back to work. You want to allow folks to build up those skills, those balance sheets, get things, feeling like the economy is moving, so that we can weather these storms or anything that kind of comes along the horizon in the months and weeks, in the weeks and months to come. But the thing that we really do see in today's data is that it is clear that the labor market at this point is not in a recession. It continues to be clear, of course, that high prices are a challenge for families, and that is why the president has focused so much of his energy on making that a priority. How do we bring costs down for families? How do we make sure that what families are experiencing in the economy is sustainable for them in terms of their budgets? That's, of course, why the Inflation Reduction Act, which is being debated right now on Capitol Hill, is so important to American families and is a part of how we keep the economy moving forward on that stable path. We keep those costs down and we keep creating jobs.
So let me go to that Inflation Reduction Act. We talked to Senator Mark Warner of Virginia earlier about that and the negotiations that went into it. It just is coming together now. It looks like they may vote on it in the Senate before the weekend is out. It sounds like the White House is definitely in favor of this package as it's been negotiated. At the same time, the reduction in the inflation looks like it's going to be more in the out years. Are you expecting a short-term relief to inflation from the passage of this act, if in fact it's enacted?
Well, this act does a number of things that directly affects family budgets. So one of the things that will expire if this act does not continue them is the subsidies that families have to be able to afford health insurance under the Affordable Care Act. So there are some additional subsidies that were put in place, and we need to extend those. That is economic relief for families, and so that is a near-term issue. Giving the government the ability and the capacity to negotiate over drug prices, this is going to bring costs down for families. It's going to be significant help. And we all know how families have been struggling with high energy prices, particularly high gas prices. Although I will note over the past month and a half now, we have seen those prices come down. And the president has been using all the tools that he has there to affect how much oil is on the market so that we can bring those prices down. But longer term, we do need to make this transition to clean energy. That's how we're going to have more stable, lower energy prices over time. So I think all of this combined really is going to provide relief for American families.
Yes, fascinating. One last one here on inflation, if we could. We have CPI numbers out next week. You mentioned the gas prices, which are coming down. We all see it at a point, no question. That affects headline. How concerned are you about core as we go into next week?
Well, I'm an economist. I work for the president. I'm very concerned about inflation. Very concerned about what we will see. But the fact that gas prices have come down and come down so much really is a good indicator of what we might see in next week's data.
Okay, Doctor, thank you very much for being with us and again for your patience with our technical problems. That's Dr. Heather Boushey of the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House. Coming up, President Biden has declared monkeypox a national health emergency. We talk with Dr. Asha Shah of Stamford Health. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, if we didn't have enough on our platter, yesterday President Biden announced that monkeypox is now a national emergency. To take us through what this emergency consists of, we welcome Dr. Asha Shah back. She's Director of Infectious Diseases at Stamford Health. Doctor, thanks so much for being with us. How big an emergency is this?
This is an emergency. And I'm glad that the president has finally declared it that way. It's something that we've been waiting for weeks, as we've seen the number of cases rise since May in this country. And the U.S. has now taken over as the country with the most cases around the world.
And so how widespread is it right now? For example, have you gotten cases up at Stamford?
Yes, we have diagnosed a handful of cases through our health system, diagnosed them successfully. The patients have recovered well, but it is a debilitating disease, and it's important that people understand how it's spread, how to prevent it, et cetera. And so it is something that we are seeing on the ground.
If we don't get our arms around it, whatever that means, you could tell me what that means, how widespread could it become? And obviously, it's not transmitted the same way. As I understand, it's not aerosolized, if that's the right word, through the air. It's by contact.
Correct. So the good news about monkeypox is that it is not as transmissible as COVID. And we're really seeing the majority of the cases are being spread through very close skin-to-skin, intimate contact, most of it seeing during sexual activity. It can spread through respiratory droplets in the air, but it's really after very prolonged close contact that most of the cases are being transmitted.
So what, as a practical matter, should we do with this emergency? How do we respond? Is it vaccination the way we eventually got to with COVID?
Yep. So I think that vaccination is important. There are 2 FDA-approved vaccines that are available. The one that's being used, obviously, most for this outbreak is the Jynneos vaccine. But we need more of it from the federal government. So I'm hopeful that now that this has been declared a public health emergency in this country, that we will get better access to vaccines and better access to therapies for patients who have severe disease. So I think this is about education. I think it's about getting the facts out about what this disease is, who it's affecting without marginalizing various communities. And I think it's about preventing it with vaccination and individuals that are considered high risk.
So I have a question that's coming from a viewer through the Bloomberg here. They can actually send me questions. And it's a little provocative, I'll tell you right now. It's asking the question, why are we making such a big deal of this? There have been 0 deaths so far. I think that's right. That's the last time I heard. And very limited hospitalizations.
So that's a great question. So actually, now there have been rare deaths reported as a part of this outbreak. Previously, there were none, but that was seen in individuals with lots of other medical conditions that made them, prone to that. And while, yes, this is not causing a great deal of mortality, this is a debilitating disease. and I can't stress that enough, these lesions and these rashes are painful. And this disease lasts for weeks. It's not like isolating 5 days for COVID and then you're back out in the community and going back to work. Patients can sometimes have to isolate for a period of a month before their rash heals. They need pain medications. They have complications because of where the lesions are located. So I want to downplay this because there's not a significant amount of mortality associated with it. There is a significant amount of morbidity. And so it is preventable with vaccine. And that's something that we need to use as a tool because nobody should have to go through having this infection.
Yeah, that's very helpful. It is serious, obviously. What about the vaccination? Should we be moving toward a world where we all get vaccinated for monkeypox?
No, so we're not there yet. Right now, vaccination is really recommended for individuals who have had a confirmed close contact with someone who's been diagnosed with monkeypox, or for individuals who are in certain high-risk groups where we are seeing that this is spreading more. And so that includes individuals who may have had multiple sexual partners in the past 2 weeks, who are interacting in social networks where monkeypox is spreading. Those are the types of individuals that should be seeking a vaccination to protect themselves, especially if those individuals have compromised immune systems. For example, individuals with HIV or other types of immunosuppressing conditions. Having that in addition to those risk factors would make someone eligible for vaccine at this point.
Should this be a research priority? How much do we know about monkeypox? I mean, it's been around for a while, but I'm not sure how much research has been done on it.
Yeah, so monkeypox is not a new disease. It's rare, but it's not new. It's endemic to parts of Africa. So I think the difference about this compared to COVID is that we do have vaccines available. We do have therapies available through the federal stockpile. I think what's important is that we get better access to those tools. And that hopefully will be made easier through this declaration by Biden yesterday that we can get more access for the things we need to protect those that are vulnerable.
Is that, doctor, because we're not making enough vaccine or we're not distributing it effectively?
I think that there was a fair number of the vaccine that expired because, again, there's an outbreak like this of monkeypox has not been seen. But I think more vaccine can be produced. And I also think more vaccine needs to be allocated to more states to help protect those that are at high risk.
Okay, this has been terribly helpful. Thank you very much. That's Dr. Asha Shah. She's Director of Infectious Diseases at Stamford Health. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, Balance of Power will continue on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk about the resumption of grain shipments out of southern Ukraine. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.